Being across the fence knee-high by the 4th of July? Not a chance. We'll learn about the challenges facing farmers from the weather to the pests. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. According to the National Weather Service, Vermont's Champlain Valley normally gets about 3 inches of rain in the month of June. But in June of 2017, we received more than 4.5 inches. Farmers don't need weather forecasts to tell them how wet it's been. While some farmers have struggled just to get a crop in the ground, the rainfall and cool temperatures are causing outbreaks of pests, which may lead to higher feed costs later this year. Across the Fence's Keith Silva tells us more about the impacts of a soggy spring.
A wet spring has turned into a wet start to summer. And that's not good for Vermont farmers or their crops.
I'm not sure if we've had a week of dry weather in April, May, or June. I think we've had rainfall every week, which makes it hard for the ground to really get dried out.
Border View Research Farm in Alburg is home to UVM Extension's Northwest Crop and Soils program. The farm is a microcosm of the challenges facing farmers in 2017. Heather Darby is a University of Vermont Extension agronomist.
This year, there's been some pretty significant challenges for farmers in general, just trying to wade their way through the multiple rainstorms and the cool weather. And so, you know, with the weather, essentially, it's brought on a lot of issues with trying to get corn planted timely, trying to get corn fertilized, weed control. With wet weather, you have wet, saturated soils. Very difficult to get them worked up. And then once you do, and you get the corn in, if it's too cold and it remains wet, then oftentimes corn germination and emergence is delayed. You get more disease pests or disease problems in the soil. So oftentimes that leads to uneven emergence of corn, poor stands, or reduced germination, and so then you have fields that might have half the planted population, or maybe a quarter, but you have less plants than you had planned on, which ultimately lowers yield.
Saturated fields and the constant wet weather has also set the stage for pests.
This year we've seen an armyworm outbreak. Armyworm moths blow up from the south in storms and wind currents, and because we've had a lot of rain and a lot of storms kind of moving up from the south, with that comes these insects. And armyworms are one, and the other one is cutworms. Both of those travel from the south. And when the moths arrive in Vermont, they look for green fields to lay eggs. So once those eggs hatch, then the worms, the armyworms, are born and they start feeding on the crops. So the more moths that come up, the more armyworms there are. And this year, in some cases, in some fields, it was quite devastating.
Those green fields where the moths lay their eggs factors into the infestation. At the urging of Darby and others, farmers have been planting more winter cover crops, which for the moths is like setting the dinner table.
You'll find a few armyworms in most fields, even in any given year. But an actual outbreak generally can be pretty localized, very spotty. And so where we've seen outbreaks this year are in high residue fields. So if there was a winter rye cover crop growing and then that was terminated and corn was planted no-till into the field, then the armyworms found that appealing and they laid eggs there. So that's where we've seen most of our outbreaks this year. There's more no-till and more cover crops throughout Vermont. We have a strong initiative to have farmers using less tillage and covering the ground through the winter. And with that can bring these other challenges in certain years. It's generally not very predictable when we'll have an armyworm outbreak. But given the fact that it was a mild winter across the United States and that it's been a stormy spring, those factors kind of line up to have those kind of outbreaks, armyworms and cutworms.
If it's not the worms or the weather, Vermont farmers are experiencing another challenge this year: bird damage.
Farmers have reported, and we've reported here too at the research farm, that bird populations are high, red-winged blackbirds and crows, and they're pecking the corn out of the ground on acres. not small patches, but acres of corn are being decimated by birds.
One solution is to replant, but that window is quickly closing.
Usually by the 4th of July, you want your corn in the ground. That's really kind of the latest, absolute latest you should be planting. At this point, you should be thinking about another type of emergency crop if you need the feed, like an annual forage, Sudan grass or millet can still be planted and harvested with some significant yield. In the Champlain Valley, we have a much longer growing season generally. And so, planting corn on the 4th of July has been done many, many, many times and still able to get yields. But the shorter the corn that you grow, shorter season corn, generally the yields tend to be a bit less. One positive note is that for farmers that have been able to get their first cut off, the yields have been really good. If we have reduced yields in our corn fields, feed inventories will be low. And feed inventories were pretty decent last year for most farmers. So, farmers should be okay for the most part. There may be some cases where people, don't have enough feed, but time will tell at this point.
Here's hoping what's left of the growing season yields a better time for Vermont farmers. In Alberg, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.
Thanks, Keith. Our next segment looks at long-term trends and conditions of our environment. When it comes to making sound public policy, decision makers need accurate and unbiased information. They get that information from one of the most expansive records of forest health, air, soil, and water quality data in the region. Across the Fence's Rebecca Gollin explains.
9424, 9423, 9422.
Students from the University of Vermont are measuring the vitals of this forest in Underhill. The checkup is part of an annual survey of forest health in Vermont.
We can definitely tell what's happening with the trees, at least short term, by looking at last year's data compared to this year's data.
The students are interns for the Vermont Monitoring Cooperative, or VMC. VMC is a partnership of the state of Vermont, the USDA Forest Service, and UVM. The group collects and maintains data about the conditions of Vermont's forests.
We take health and we take the diameter at breast height, DBH, and then we also do some qualitative assessments of the trees to measure their health, like their vigor, the amount of dieback, so the amount of growth that didn't continue from last year, and transparency of the foliage. And we also do some assessments of the actual seedlings that are growing to tell what's regenerating, what's successful at the plot, what likes growing there and what doesn't.
VMC maintains a network of 42 forest monitoring plots around the state, including 17 at Mount Mansfield. Their focus on forest health means taking a close look at anything that might affect the ecosystem.
We look at air, water, wildlife, and then the actual trees for figuring out what the state of the Vermont forest is.
Jim Duncan is a researcher and analyst at the VMC. The information the group has collected provides a detailed look at forest health over the years.
While we do focus on the forests of Vermont, we're looking at kind of the regional context of that. And in general, Vermont's 80% forested, so most of the state is our playground, and we really get to think about the air, water, forests around the state.
VMC was created in 1990 when it became clear that various researchers around the state were working on the same types of projects. The idea was to gather and catalog data about forest ecosystems in Vermont and create an accessible information hub for scientists around the state and region.
It was born out of the idea that there's people who are all trying to kind of do the same thing, and they didn't know that each other were working on the same projects. So the catalog kind of sprung from that, but it's become really taken on a life of its own as a way to get data out there for people. And often we just also provide a home for data that has no home.
Some of their studies can take quite a while, including a couple of soil monitoring sites that are part of a 200-year survey of soil chemistry and health.
Sugar maple live.
Sugar maple live.
Yellow birch live.
Yellow birch live, another one.
Tracking the same forest plots every year, helps to identify any pest outbreaks and diseases in the short term. But in the long term, the data that VMC collects is crucial for getting a big picture view of what's going on in Vermont's forests.
More than anything, I think that those monitoring frameworks provide the way to ask the next question, right? 20 years ago, people weren't really thinking about climate change in the same way. Without the monitoring data that we've been collecting for 20 years, you'd have to wait another 20 to start answering those climate change questions.
3 more red maple.
What I'm doing is looking at the down woody debris. So how many branches have fallen, what size they are, how many there are on the ground, that sort of thing, to sort of paint a picture both of how much carbon there is in the forest, and in addition, what kind of structure there is for different wildlife, like birds and that sort of thing.
Josh Hallman is a forest health specialist with the state. He's here to help the VMC crew collect data.
It's important to track these changes annually. A lot can change year to year, but more importantly, these are long-term plots. And so the more data that we can collect year after year, it builds a richer data set, and it can inform us a lot more clearly about what changes are occurring in the environment and within our forests here as well.
To get the full picture of forest health, the group monitors different aspects of air and water quality as well, maintaining a number of testing stations around the state.
We have several programs that focus in different places. We have some intensive sites where we tried to co-locate a lot of different monitoring programs so that you can kind of monitor the status of the ecosystem and its response across a number of different variables, from the soils to the water to the trees and the wildlife responses.
One of those intensive sites is right here in Underhill, where a field full of air quality monitoring instruments sits just down the road from the forest plots.
We have a couple of different rain gauges. We have the chandelier rain gauge over there, which is digital.
As an air quality technician for VMC, Mim Pendleton collects samples and maintains the many instruments used here.
We have precipitation measurements, and then we have chemical analysis of the samples. So if you know how much rain or how much air you've sucked through a filter pack, you know what the volume is, and from that you can know what the total deposition in a place is and the concentration. So those deposition and concentration measurements are what scientists look at to, see if there's going to be some impact on like aquatic water bodies or vegetation or whatever.
Pendleton has seen positive changes over the years, such as vast improvements in acid rain after federal legislation in the 1980s.
The pH of rain back then was in the low 4s, sometimes high 3s, which is really acid, and now it's in the 5s. So much less acid, and pH, the higher the number, the less acidity. Plus it's a logarithmic thing, so it's not like, oh, it's only 2 times less acid. It's more like it's 20 times less acid. It's a different order of magnitude.
According to the data, Vermont's forest health is good right now.
In general, the forests are pretty resilient here, and they've recovered a lot since the clearing in the 1800s. So my perspective is, on the whole, we're doing pretty well. But certainly things like fragmentation and water quality challenges are going to be huge for the state, and the forests have a pretty big role to play in that.
Keeping an eye on challenges to the state by tracking the health of its ecosystem. The Vermont Monitoring Cooperative has the information it needs to keep going. In Underhill, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for joining us. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.